So, just to bring us up to speed, in the last Bible study that we did, which was like 2 weeks ago now, we took a closer look at Genesis chapter 40, and that was Joseph's experience while he was in jail. And basically, while he's in jail, Joseph proves himself to be the model inmate. And for this reason, he rises up to this position of considerable authority in the hierarchy of the prison system. And eventually, he meets two new inmates, both of whom are civil servants who've been put in jail for offending Pharaoh. And one of them is Pharaoh's chief cupbearer. The other one is Pharaoh's chief baker. And to make a long story short, both of these men have dreams. Pharaoh interprets those dreams. And his interpretation of the cupbearer's dream is quite favorable. And in the end, the cupbearer is released from prison and he's restored to his former position in the civil service of Pharaoh. Joseph asked the cupbearer, basically, he said to him, look, when you get out and you go back under the service of Pharaoh, mention me to Pharaoh. Tell him that I'm in jail. Tell him that I don't deserve to be in jail. And maybe Pharaoh can intervene on my behalf and give me a, presidential pardon of some kind, right? But the cupbearer forgets to do this. We are told, chapter 40, verse 23, the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. So therefore, Joseph is left to suffer in prison for another 2 whole years. And you have to think how hard that would have been for poor Joseph, right? He didn't know the meaning of the delay. Did the cupbearer just forget about him? Did the cupbearer tell Pharaoh, and did Pharaoh just not care? So Joseph is left wondering and waiting, which is often the case with promises that come from God. There are all sorts of promises that are in the scriptures, right? And the ultimate promise, I suppose, is that Jesus will reign over all creation as Lord and put an end to all of the horrible things that we're used to experiencing in this world. But we're waiting, and the waiting sometimes seems to go on forever. So it's this struggle with waiting that Joseph is experiencing right now. But he doesn't wait forever. His story is definitely not put on hold forever. Things move on. And the things that move his story on, the thing that moves his story on, is, as usual, a dream. And in this case, it's a dream that Pharaoh has. And it's a very disturbing dream and a very bizarre dream, as dreams can often be. And I'll get into that dream in a minute, but for now, all we need to know is this. Pharaoh, upon waking, has trouble interpreting this dream. The scriptures say, in the morning, Pharaoh's spirit was troubled. So he sent and called for the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them to Pharaoh. So I think I mentioned this in last week's Bible study, but there seems to have been this cadre of educated men in the court of Pharaoh. There were men schooled in dream interpretation, possibly schooled in astrology. In fact, the Magi from chapter 2 of Matthew's Gospel, the Magi who come to visit Jesus, are probably similar kinds of people. They're educated men. They're working in the civil service of some empire in the East, right? So at any rate, Pharaoh reaches out to these wise men, these Magi in his own court, in hopes that they're going to be able to interpret his dream for him, but they're unsuccessful. And as we learn later, Joseph basically is able to succeed where all of those magicians have failed. Joseph succeeds where the Magi fail. And I think this is a pattern, and you see it being played out all throughout the scriptures, right? I'll give you an example. When King Nebuchadnezzar has the dream of this great statue, he asks his men if they can not only interpret the dream, but tell him what the dream was, right? Do you remember that story? And no one can tell Nebuchadnezzar what the dream is. No one in his court, anyway, right? But Daniel succeeds in doing this. Also, in the book of Exodus, the magicians of Pharaoh are often contrasted with Moses. Moses, through the power of God, can do a whole bunch of things that Pharaoh's magicians can't do. And I think the idea here is that God's Spirit is at work in a special way among his people, allowing them to do what other people can't do. And here in Genesis 41, what do we see? Well, God's power is working through Joseph, allowing Joseph to interpret Pharaoh's dreams when even the Magi can't do that. At any rate, Pharaoh's cupbearer somehow learns about his master's trouble regarding these dreams, and at this point he remembers. Finally, he remembers Joseph, and he thinks to himself, yes, there was that Hebrew guy. I was in jail with him when I did time a few years ago. And as I recall, he was really good at interpreting dreams. So what happens is the chief cupbearer informs Pharaoh of this. Pharaoh then makes inquiries about Joseph and has him summoned to the palace. So Joseph is now summoned to the palace. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I've had a dream, and there's no one who can interpret it. I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not I. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Dream interpretation, and I mentioned this before, was considered to be a very, very specific skill at the time. Different objects in dreams stood for different things. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, there were whole volumes dedicated to dream images and the things that those dreams represented. And one's ability to interpret dreams involved not just like intelligence and skill, but it also required this working knowledge of, dream symbols, right? So, in short, dream interpretation was a very human skill. Joseph's ability to interpret dreams, however, comes from a different source, right? He's special. And I want you to remember what Joseph says this himself to Pharaoh. He says, it is not I. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. It is not I, God. So Joseph isn't relying on some encyclopedic knowledge of dreams and symbols and that sort of thing. He doesn't rely on his own mastery of dream interpretation. Rather, he relies entirely on divine insight. He's acting essentially like a prophet. And this idea was established back in chapter 40. Joseph says, do not interpretations belong to God? So this gets back to the idea, again, frequently repeated in previous chapters, that God is with Joseph in a special way. God is the one who's empowering Joseph to succeed the way he does. God is the one who empowers Joseph to interpret dreams successfully. So having informed Pharaoh that his ability to interpret dreams comes entirely from God and not from himself or anyone else, Joseph is then told the dreams. Pharaoh tells him the dreams. And Pharaoh has two dreams, both of which are set along the shores of the Nile. And I think you all know what the dreams are, right? In one dream, 7 fat cows rise up from the Nile River, followed by 7 thin, emaciated cows. And the thin cows eat the fat ones. Okay, so again, this is a dream here, so things get bizarre. In the second dream, 7 ripe, full heads of grain grow up along the Nile. Then 7 thin, blighted heads of grain spring up next, and the thin, blighted grain consumes the larger, fat, healthy grains. And immediately, like Joseph doesn't hesitate, he knows exactly what's going on, right? But before he offers his take on those dream symbols and what they mean, he offers a really interesting piece of commentary. Listen to this. This is Genesis 41:25. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dreams are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. So I think Joseph is saying something really important. He's saying that not only does dream interpretation come from God, but this particular dream itself that Pharaoh has had has come from God. The dream is of divine origin. And I want you to know that Pharaoh is used to operating in a closed system. I'll explain what I mean by that. He's used to operating in his own sphere that he has complete control over, the court of Egypt, the royal court in Egypt. So the buck stops with him. He is the ultimate and final authority. He is the one who decides policy. He is the one who implements the policy to bring about the desire in the end that he wants. But what's happening in this story is God is breaking through that system and imposing a new reality, and it's a reality that Pharaoh has no control over whatsoever. The theologian Walter Brueggemann, who's an Old Testament theologian, writes this: "It is already done. It is established and decided without any particular reference to Pharaoh. The future in Egypt does not depend upon Pharaoh. He does not get to decide. The king is helpless in the face of God's coming future." At any rate, Joseph offers his interpretation of the dream. He says, the 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after the healthy ones are 7 years, as are the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty all throughout the land of Egypt. After them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land. So yeah, God has shown Pharaoh what he's going to do, whether Pharaoh likes it or not. Now, there doesn't mean that there can be now no form of human action, right? Just because God has acted, it doesn't mean that human beings just can do nothing but sit there and watch, right? Human beings can act in response to God's will. In fact, Joseph proposes that they do just that. And he basically says to Pharaoh, look, in light of the fact that we know that God is going to do this, here's what we ought to do. Appoint imperial overseers to gather 1/5 of all the land's produce during those years of plenty, during the fat years, and then store them in granaries all throughout the cities of Egypt. And so when the 7 years of famine finally give way to the 7 years, when the 7 years of plenty give way to the years of famine, we'll have a reserve of food in the land of Egypt so that there'll be enough for everybody to eat. So that's Joseph's solution to all of this. And I think there's a lesson here, and the lesson is this, right? God reveals his ultimate will, and we are to decide how we live our lives in response to God's will. Do you understand? You see what I mean?
Say that again.
God reveals his ultimate will, and we are to decide how we live our lives based on what God has said he will do. God's will, for example, is that one day all of creation, the heavens and the earth, will bow before Christ and proclaim Jesus as Lord. So that has been revealed in Scripture. Now, if that's God's ultimate will, if at the end of time God is going to do this thing, shouldn't that have an impact on the way we live our lives now? Right? So if God is ultimately going to allow Christ to reign over all creation as Lord of all, shouldn't that impact the decisions that we make in terms of goals that we pursue, who we spend time with, what we do with our money, right? At any rate, Pharaoh is really pleased with Joseph, not just because of his dream interpretation, but his willingness to step up and propose a solution, right? If 7 years of famine are coming, what are we going to do? And Joseph has a whole strategy for that. Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find anyone else like this, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only with regard to the throne will I be greater than you." This is a familiar pattern by now in the story of Joseph, I think. Joseph finds himself, for whatever reason, in some crazy random situation, maybe serving in the home of Potiphar as a slave or locked away in jail. And there, while he's in that setting, he rises up to this position of tremendous authority. So he becomes basically lord over Potiphar's house. Then he becomes like the warden's right-hand man in prison. And it's a sign that God is with Joseph in a special way. In fact, Pharaoh recognizes this. He says, "Can we find anyone else like this, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" And it's interesting that Pharaoh speaks of Joseph as one who possesses the Spirit of God. Uh, remember how in the Gospels, Jesus reads from the scroll of Isaiah and he applies what he reads to himself. You remember that when he's in the synagogue? And this is the passage Jesus reads. He says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of our Lord's favor." So we've talked in the past about how Joseph is like a type of Christ. In other words, there's something about the shape of Joseph's life story that sort of suggests or anticipates Jesus. We talked about this before. Joseph is betrayed by his brothers. Jesus is betrayed by humanity. Joseph is thrown into an empty pit and later he's thrown into jail. Jesus is thrown into the grave. Joseph emerges from the pit alive and ascends to a position of high authority. Jesus emerges from the grave alive and he ascends to the right hand of God. Joseph's brothers bow down to him. Humanity bends the knee to Christ. So it's the similar story arc, right? Now we learn that like Jesus, Joseph too has the Spirit of God. And Pharaoh himself could see that. He says, there's no one else that I know who has the Spirit of God like Joseph does. At any rate, Joseph is married off to a good Egyptian woman named Asenath, I think I'm pronouncing that right, daughter of a very prominent priest, Potipharah, from the city of On. It goes without saying that this priest likely worshipped the sun god, Ra, not the God of heaven and earth, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But anyway, Joseph is married. And having been married off to a respectable woman, Joseph has 2 kids. And I'll just touch on these 2 kids and then we'll call it a day and we'll talk about the passage a little bit. The first is named Manasseh. Manasseh means to forget or something like that. Joseph has forgotten apparently 2 things. He's forgotten all of my hardship, so all of the stuff that he's been through ever since his brothers sold him into slavery. He's moved on from that. There's a lot of water under the bridge since those days, right? However, Joseph has also forgotten all my father's house. Since having been sold into slavery, Joseph has come a long way. He's probably learned Egyptian language, Egyptian culture. He's essentially become an Egyptian in some ways. Now he's in charge of the entire land of Egypt. So he's forgotten his father's house. He's moved on from that. Joseph claims that God made him forget his past. And this could very well be true. However, God is going to remind Joseph of his true identity soon in the story. It's not over yet. Because really, he's not an Egyptian. He is a son of Jacob. He's a child of Israel. And he's the one whom God has sent to save the people of Israel from famine. Very important. Joseph has another son named Ephraim. The word means to be fruitful. Joseph specifies that he has been fruitful in the land of my misfortunes. He says, I've been fruitful in the land of my misfortunes. And I think this is God's calling on his chosen people, whether it happens to be the chosen people of Israel or the chosen people of the church. We are called to be fruitful in the land of our misfortune. We are called to bear the fruit of righteousness and peace and love. In fact, we're called to be fruitful even when we are in exile. And I think all of this life, this reality that we live in now, is a life in exile, right? But we're called to be fruitful even here, even though, this is not where we belong. Just as Joseph is fruitful in Egypt, just as Israel is fruitful in Babylon and Persia and Greece and Rome. So the Lord says through the lips of the prophet Jeremiah, and I've quoted this before during the course of these few weeks, increase in number there, do not decrease. This is Jeremiah speaking to the exiles in Persia, or in Babylon. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. I said Isaiah before, I actually meant to say Jeremiah. But that's what Joseph has done in the land of Egypt. He's been fruitful, he's prospered. So that's where the story ends for now. He is in a position of tremendous power and authority in Pharaoh's court. He's forgotten about his life back home in Canaan, but eventually something's going to happen that will remind him of his old life and remind him of his true identity. And we'll talk about that next week.